Hello, welcome to the Game Design for Student Success webinar series. We are going to get started since it is now 3 o'clock Eastern. So this is a continuation of our series. Today's session will cover creating a narrative. I'm Candace Best. I've been your host and presenter for each of these webinar sessions. It's my pleasure to continue to do so today. Our normal housekeeping items I will go through very quickly. This is being recorded and will appear on our YouTube page and on our broadcast page shortly within 30 minutes after the webinar concludes. As always, we invite any colleagues that are not registered to do so that they can be independently alerted to the remaining webcasts as we prepare to publish them, and also so that they can post questions and comments that we can respond to even after the live webinar is over. So those questions and comments need to be posted to our broadcast page, which you receive a URL to when you register, not to the YouTube page. So again, I would encourage you to make sure you signed up with us so that you can continue to ask questions about anything we cover, and I can get right back to you on that. Live tweeting is encouraged using the hashtag GDSS, and Brooklyn Bingo refers to our broadcast location. And in order to participate, if you hear a siren or a horn at any point during the live broadcast, and only during the live broadcast, and you type in Brooklyn Bingo into the comment box on our broadcast page, not on the YouTube page, then we will send you a $5 gift card. So that's our little game, Brooklyn Bingo. So with that, this is the last of the 6 simple machines of game design that we are covering. So that will complete our review of the basic elements of design. I can't believe we've gotten through so many. It seems like we just started this yesterday. But this is perhaps the most fun part of it, I believe. And so what we're going to do today is obviously describe the purpose of creating a narrative. I'll revisit the definition that I provided at the very beginning, so that you can be reacquainted to the purpose of narrative. And then we're going to spend a good part of today's session actually looking at how narrative is used in actual game applications. As I've mentioned in many of the previous sessions that we've done, the best way to really get a sense of what game design looks like is after you've seen these principles that we've covered, then go back and play one of your favorite games or download a game on your phone, and then look for those elements in action, because then they start to pop out at you and you see how the deliberate use of design is what really drives your enjoyment of the game, if it's a game that you come back to often. And then the mechanics that we talked about the previous 2 sessions will take on greater value when you see how to use them deliberately. And that will also be the case in today's session, where we talk about narrative, and I'll show you how narrative and mechanics and design all fit together. And then, as always, we'll conclude by then applying what we've talked about with respect to game design to your educational goals. So first, a definition, or a revisiting of the definition that I provided at the beginning of our series. So a narrative, the narrative design element, is what gives your game context and purpose, and it uses meaning to move the players to mastery. So we've been talking about moving players to mastery for quite some time. Here's a reminder, or a revisit to our previous few weeks. We've used this diagram to illustrate both progression when using the GDSS model, the Game Design for Student Success Progression Arc model, and this notion of flow, where you're trying to balance challenge with skill and ability. So when we talk about moving players to mastery, or our students to mastery, this is a good visualization, and this is what the Game Design for Student Success framework was organized to give a structure to and around. And so how does narrative fit within that? Well, let's start by just comparing some games. If you've ever played either of these games, or both of these games, as I have, Cooking Dash and Cooking Craze, they both have the same purpose. They both involve a game where the loops are just the player preparing meals and then serving them based on what the animated customers who come in ask for. As you go through the game, you learn how to prepare more meals. You have challenges regarding how quickly you are able to make those meals and whether you've gotten all the ingredients right. But at the core, they're both doing the same thing. So what's only different, the only thing that's different is the narrative. And so at a high level difference, obviously they have a different name, but they also have created their own narrative. So Cooking Dash in the current iteration, if you downloaded it recently, and I actually have both of these on my phone, I'm telling a lot about my my guilty habits. But what Cooking Dash has done is taking the position of you as the player actually hosting your own cooking show. Whereas with Cooking Craze, the narrative is really around opening up new restaurants in different locales and different locations. So in different cities and different countries. And then the meals you're preparing within each country are are tied to that locale. So it starts out, I think, in New York, and you're making burgers, and then you go to Italy, and then you're making pizza and pasta, and then you're moving on. Whereas with Cooking Dash, the narrative goes with the progression. You go from having one show where you're cooking one kind of meal to another show where you're cooking a different type of meal. But in both instances, you're doing the same thing, but the narrative drives the experience of how you're doing it. Another example, though, is Candy Crush and Bejeweled. If you really think about it, you are doing the exact same thing in both games. You are matching up like, 4 or 5 or 3 of a kind, and the more of a similar type you can link together, the better the prize, the reward, and that's how the game is advanced. But if you've played both of them, the basic loop, the basic skill that you have to use to advance in the game is exactly the same. What's different? The narrative. In Candy Crush, the narrative is around matching a bunch of candies, and Bejeweled, it was around different types of jewels. So it was really the narrative that made the difference, because without it, if you think about it, since you're being asked to do the same thing, why would you come back? Why would you download one versus the other? And if you think about it from the perspective of the game designer, especially if I don't know the backstory, but I'm assuming that the company that puts out Bejeweled is different from the company that puts out Candy Crush. They're competing to get you to do the same thing. So how is it that these competing companies get you to do the same thing, but download one or the other or both? It has to be the narrative that is the story that they're trying to give you, that's compelling enough to you or interesting enough to you for you to decide that even though I've played Candy Crush, I've advanced many levels, I know how to do it, I'm also going to play Bejeweled, or vice versa, because there's something about the way this is presented that makes me think that it's something that I would still want to try. So to me, the best example of this is Solitaire. And if you are a person of a certain age, and I won't name that age, but if you're a person of a certain age and you remember when personal computers were first becoming ubiquitous in households, not like they are now, but we were just starting to bring computers into the household, and computers weren't as complex and you didn't have as many options. Very often there would be one game downloaded for you to play. If you didn't have some sort of software that you were using it for, there was a standard game that was also loaded that you could use for amusement, and it was Solitaire. That was, one might argue, the original computer game that anyone who was on the computer learned to play, because that was all you would play. And what it was asking you to do was very, very simple, right? You had to clear the cards, you had to play the cards in a certain order to clear them from the bottom to the top. And if you cleared all your cards off the bottom, then you won the game. It's the complexity, or the challenge, comes from the fact that every time you start a new game, you don't know how the cards are going to be ordered when you flip them over. So that variation is what provides some interest and gives you some reason to come back. That's some variation, some novelty. But at the end of the day, the goal is always the same. You want to get players playing, and you want to keep players playing. That's all that any basic game designer is trying to do. The strength or the success of a game is it interesting enough? Is what the player is being asked to do compelling enough that they will want to start playing and want to continue playing? And if you think about what Solitaire was, in terms of getting the player playing, it had the benefit of novelty. there just weren't a lot of games on the computer. The whole process of being on the computer or playing on a computer was so novel, and there was no competition. So they didn't really so much have to worry about getting players to play, because if you weren't going to be on the computer to do something very computer like, and you were looking for a diversion, that was pretty much all there was. So the get players playing was not much of a challenge. The keep players playing, well, what they did was basically replicate a game that people were already playing. So the the model of solitaire being an engaging game was already in existence from the tangible version of the game, the card version of the game. It's a game that's gone back years. It's a game that you don't have to have someone else to play. So it was logical that, okay, if we're going to start with computer games, let's start with a game that doesn't require you to have an opponent, that we know people already like to play because it's been around for decades, if not hundreds of years. I don't know when solitaire started. So the get players playing and the keep players playing was already built in. All the first game designers had to do was just figure out how to convert that to an online format. As far as mechanics, they had some basic mechanics available to them. There's challenge and frustration in that, the order of the cards may not go your way. But in the early versions of Solitaire, they really didn't use a lot of these mechanics. They weren't really levels or boss fights or progressive unlocks. There wasn't, there might be points in some of the games, and sometimes there weren't. You just started all over the next time. And again, in the early stages of games, you didn't need as much. But where are we now? Well, now we have the challenge of, we do have a lot of competition. There are thousands of games competing for attention, and we have this additional wrinkle for professional game studios is, in addition to keeping players playing, they also want the players to spend money. That's the added challenge or objective of any studio, and there are plenty, that their business is to make games. And if it's a business, then they want you to spend money. How do you get people to spend money on something like solitaire? Right? It's no one's going to pay for the solitaire on the left. So we're going to use this game, Fairway Solitaire, to show how narrative is used to take what was a very static game from our youth, very boring, a game that you don't even need a computer to play. If you have a deck of cards, you can play it. That was put onto the computer, that became something that people played a lot. But then how was it that they're able to take this basic game and turn it into something where you could actually get people to give you money? And the narrative is key to that. So I'm going to walk you through that and also point out how mechanics are used and how all of the other game design principles are also present, but all used to deliberately and within the context provided by this narrative to achieve their objective. Now, starting the narrative, it should be obvious to you. If it's not, I'll make it explicit. Clearly, the core narrative of this Fairway Solitaire is that you're playing solitaire, but it takes on the form or the identity of a golf game. So everything within it, so you can see here, everything is around the standard loop that you would engage in playing solitaire, which is to stack up the cards in ascending or descending order, is still the basic loop that you would play in solitaire. But they've now rebranded it. They've now embedded it within this narrative that clearing out your deck, clearing out all of the cards is equivalent to successfully completing a round of golf. It's really it's low-key brilliant, I think. And you'll see in a second why, because now with this narrative, it allows them to start bringing in so many more game mechanics that function the way we know game mechanics do. And we'll see in a second, that would not and were not present in the standard old version of solitaire that you played if you're of a certain age, or your mom played, or your grandma played, or may still play. So let's start with progressive unlocks. Up in this upper right-hand corner where you see the arrow, what you're seeing here is a meter that is showing every time you place a card. And so I should say, the Fairway Solitaire sort of flips the version. So you're clearing the cards from the top instead of from the bottom, and you're clearing them based on the card that's showing at the very bottom by the deck, by the number that says 23. So in this instance, the next card I would click on is one of the 10s. You would either click one one card above or below. So in this case, I would either have to be able to pick a 10 or an 8. Since there's no 8 showing, I would pick one of those 10s, click on it. It would come down to the bottom as the exposed card. And then I would have to pick something above or below a 10. So it either would have to be a jack or it would have to be another 9. So you'd either have to hope that the card you uncovered when you pulled the 10 down had a 9 or a jack um, showing. If it didn't, then you've got to pull from the deck, right? But what the game is also trying to get you to do, or is rewarding you or encouraging you to do, is to have a streak, right? To be able to pull a number of cards from the top before you have to pull from the deck. And if you do that successfully, so this progressive unlock is actually keeping track of how the streak of cards you pulled from the top before you had to pull from the deck. And if you are able, it may be difficult to see unless you're looking closely, but that colored meter also has dots. So those dots indicate how many cards in a row you had to pull from the top before you pulled from the deck. And if you complete it, then that arrow keeps going forward. And then if you complete enough of a streak, then on the right, those two blue and then one gold that you see are actually cards. So you get your reward is you get another card in the deck. So the first time you go through, you get another card in the deck. So you actually have 3 streaks. Each streak has to be a little bit longer than the one before it. But if you get to the 3rd streak, that means you've done a long enough streak to get through both of the blue cards back to the deck. Then a gold card pops up, and that gold card actually is something that you pick from, and then it's what we would call a uh, variable. On the reward schedule. It would be a ratio variable schedule, because you don't know what you're going to get, but once you unlock the card, it could be some form of currency, which would be the next mechanic that you see here that we didn't typically see in a standard solitaire game. They have their own virtual currency. I think they're called golf bucks. So you can see there how many golf bucks you are accumulating or that you have to spend in order to progress in the game or to do things. You also see virtual goods. And again, here, you see again, all of this is tied to the same narrative. In this instance, if you don't have, so let's say we want to proceed, right? The next card is a 10, and after that, we need either a jack or a 9. You have the option of using a golf club to continue the streak. So the streak would continue above and it wouldn't cost you anything. So those goods now become valuable. Having these golf clubs are a way for you to continue the streak um, without having to break it and without having to pull from the deck. So now that adds. Now we have 2 mechanics that add to the value of the experience of the game. Now, constraints. What you see here is the card that is being pointed. There are 2 constraints. One constraint is that if you can't continue a streak because of the cards that are showing, or because, let's say, you don't have any golf clubs left, then you have to pull from the deck. There are a finite number of cards to pull from the deck. So if you exhaust all of the cards in the deck before you've cleared the top, that's a constraint. And in the early iterations of the game, that's your only constraint. As the arcs continue and arcs get linked to other arcs, they add additional constraints. You're looking at one example of a constraint, which is it's what they call a water trap, right? So they're again still using the narrative. So the narrative of like your ball falling into the water, they have these water trap cards. And what that means is you have to clear all of the cards that are in underwater before the cards that are red facing you will flip over. So that's like an added constraint. It's an added layer of difficulty to the game to make it a little bit more challenging. The last thing I want to bring your attention to is something that we actually haven't talked about in any of the previous sessions, and that is something called a goal gradient. And what goal gradient refers to is giving a visual representation of intermediate progress, because there have been some studies that show that if you can see your progress, if you can see that you're close to success, that actually gives you an added push to keep going. And I'll tell you in a second how they use that masterfully towards their goal of getting you to spend money, getting you to do things like once you run out of golf clubs, you can buy golf clubs, right? Or you can buy additional currency to buy golf clubs. And so this notion of you being just close enough, all you need is one more card and there's no card left. So it's not showing here, but they have other features that if you exhaust the free, then you can pay for it. But all of that is pulling on our desire to make progress. And what goal gradients do is they make that progress look a lot closer. Right. And so if you have some way of visually showing that actually you're pretty close to success, goal gradients are a way to do that. And they're very, very effective at getting the player to stick with it. So now let's look at progression. So they show progression in a number of ways. And what's interesting is if you look at the bottom, what you're looking at is the progression would be moving from what they call one golf course to the next. So if you see these names on the bottom, the Kings Beach, okay, Bayou, and the little numbers in the flags, that is each of those squares represents a golf course. The number in the flag tells you how many rounds of golf you need to play to complete the course. So you see in this image that I'm showing, you have 3 rounds of golf, 6 rounds of golf, but they also have 9 rounds of golf. And so they have the main place that you can go to progress. They also have a bonus, which is you're playing rounds of golf in each of these. But in this instance, to get access to more rounds, you need to have earned a certain number of cups. So now we're starting to see, again, different types of rewards and achievements all layered together to create this sense of not only progression, but this is another form of progressive unlock. So you see unlock with 500, it's letting you know you have to achieve some other level in some aspect of the game in order to earn the right to go forward. That also is a constraint that builds the sense of wanting to go back and to finish. But you also see prizes you would get for playing it. So at the same time, they're giving you some hint that this is worth pursuing. You're going to want to continue. It's all little seeds to get you to want to continue playing. The other thing that they do is in distinguishing between main and bonus is they use the bonus golf uh, courses, so to speak, to allow them to do themes that keep the experience fresh. So everything always stays within the the main narrative of a golf course or playing golf. The other playful thing that they do, and you may have noticed it, I didn't point it out, but when I showed that opening image of the game, there was this gopher with this sarcastic look on its face. I'll say it to him, I guess it's a he, on his face. The golfer is also a recurring theme. He becomes a recurring constraint. So periodically he'll pop up and he'll steal your golf clubs or he'll take your money from you. He'll do different things to introduce a constraint. So you, again, within the narrative, you also have this image. They have created actually a character to also represent a constraint, but in a playful way that is consistent with this overall narrative. So this is the gopher on the golf course that is creating divots and creating havoc. They've now represented it as part of the narrative of the game, and so it continues with the theme and continues to give you a sense of what your purpose is in the game. But one of the things that I also think they do really, really well, as you see on the bottom, so I showed you there's the main set of golf courses that you can play around with, there's bonus, and then they have daily. And this, I think, is particularly sharp of them. So one of the things that many players, game designers also want is they not only want you to keep coming back and playing, they know that the more this becomes a routine, the more it will become a habit. And the best way for something to become a habit is for you to do it daily. And so all games, especially games that, where they want to make their money off of it, they want you to play as much as possible. That's the reason why they create these narratives that allow them to continue. They also want you to come back every day. And what many games do in an attempt to do that is they give you rewards for streaks. So every day that you come back consecutively without breaking a streak, then you get some additional benefits. So that is compelling. That is trading on our very basic understanding of external rewards. If you keep coming back, we'll keep giving you more things. It works to a point. It works until it doesn't work. And the flip side of using that strategy is that while maintaining the streak is very much like it trades on the same emotional need for completion that the goal gradient does it physically, visually. The streak also is trading on the same thing. We don't want to break the streak, we want to continue. The problem with is that often once the streak is broken, something happens, you forget, you didn't come back. It actually can have the exact opposite effect. It can be, in some instances, very demotivating and can cause the player to not want to play anymore. Because as you see that you've made all this progress and now it's wiped out because you missed a day, then it can also cause the player to abandon the game. Right now, some games will counter that by allowing you to pay to extend your streak. Right. So again, now they're tying in currency and the use of currency as a way of fitting in with the game. But what this game does that I think is really, really a nifty way of addressing that interest in getting you to come back daily that doesn't rely on the limitations or isn't hampered by the limitations of a streak is that they have a separate set of challenges. So let's treat them all, let's call them missions. That would be consistent with the mission or quest mechanic. They have a separate one that's just daily. So this changes every day. Main and bonus, they progress based on, with the main one, you open up a new course when you finish the previous course. With the bonus, I'll go back. With the bonus, you have to actually achieve a certain number of cups, they call it, before you can unlock, right? So with the daily, you don't have to do anything. Every day, there are 3 new courses. But look at what's on this page. There's a couple of things going. One, you see the 3 um, courses that are available for you for the day. You also get a gift. It automatically. Each day, there's a different kind of gift, and the gift is always related to some resource that's of value in the game. So what the image you're seeing now is shuffle. That's a resource that if you're stuck, you don't have any more, you don't see any cards that are available that you can use, you can press shuffle and it'll reshuffle the cards and potentially you'll see one now that will come up that you can use. So that's one. Eraser is another resource that they have available. And that's when you finish a round, if you had a really bad round, you can erase it and you can start over. And then they have a resource that's called preview where you can actually see 5 cards ahead in the deck to see if the cards that are in the deck will be useful to you. So what they do is they rotate. Each day you'll get one of these gifts just by showing up. You don't have to do anything. That gift is there. You don't know which one it is, but every day there'll be a different one. And it refreshes, the daily gift refreshes every 8 hours. So potentially, if you come back twice, or 3 times, I guess, if you don't sleep, you might have 3 chances to get this free gift. The mini game, though, are different little mini games that they play, very quick little games, and I think there are about 4 or 5 of them. This refreshes every 3 hours, but the mini game always results in you getting currency. So the prize in that mini game is if you are successful in it. Some games are easier to play than others, but the result of playing that game is that you'll also be able to get more currency. Always things of value, right? But all together giving you incentive. And as you can see, you can also earn currency by completing these 3 games and whatever the challenge is. So the mission or the quest, to use mechanic terms, whatever that is for the day, as it says, you see your goal for today, it's giving you a daily goal, immediate gratification, you know what you would win to complete. So they've layered all these things together to give you a great reason if you miss a day and then you come back, yeah, you missed whatever that prize was for that day, but there's a new prize. So you don't have the demotivating effects of breaking a streak, but you do have a unique combination of mechanics and design that's been used to leverage all of the different motivators that we've talked about, all of the different mechanics to encourage you to come back daily. It's really smart. And in the process, so the reason why I put emotions is that when you play those little games, because it's a little hit of a game, you feel a sense of emotion. Sometimes it's just pick a card. Sometimes it's whack-a-mole. This is the image that's showing here. And that burst of adrenaline that you get from playing that game, or for knowing that, okay, in another few minutes and it'll refresh and I'll have another chance to make some quick golf bucks. That gives you all these different emotions. Certainly the frustration that happens when you don't meet a challenge, or when you have to you end up spending too much of your currency and now you have to bring it back. All of these are emotions that, and it's a silly game, but yet it will engender these emotions because being invested in this narrative and playing it, the more you play it, the more you get invested in it. And I do want to say one more thing before we move forward about currency, because there are some games that do a really good job of that. What you're looking at, the the golf bucks on the upper right, and then on the upper left you see stars, and you see the number next to the cups, right? So we've talked about how the cups can help you um earn uh earn access to bonus. These rewards that we've talked about, there's also a store. So there are multiple ways in which you can earn more coins, that you can earn more resources within the game to keep you engaged, to keep you seeing this as something that's emotional and valuable to you. But what you see, though, is that each one of these types of resources or assets has an important value. And in some games that I've played, they'll have these multiple because in some respect, if you have to spend something, so the golf books are currency, but the cups are also a form of currency. If you have multiple forms of currency, but the player doesn't have to spend them, then they lose value. What makes your virtual currency, and it's really fascinating, right? What makes any currency valuable and what will make you get excited about a particular currency that has no use outside of the game is the notion that a well-designed game will force you to spend it. It will force you to expend it so that now getting it back gives you this rush and this emotion that keeps you coming. And really good games build in ways for you to do that. In fact, there's a little trick that I've noticed with this particular game that they do really well. If you get too many books, if you see, this is actually a screenshot. I'm embarrassed to show you how much I've played this game. On this particular day, I've amassed 12,000 golf bucks. There have been some days that between the combination of what I've earned from playing and the mini games, I've been able to, amass a fairly large bank of golf bucks. And then you spend those golf bucks to do things like buying clubs and some other things. So there's always a reason to spend. But one of the things that I noticed that they will do is one of the constraints that will show up when you're playing the game is sometimes you'll get a card where the golfer shows up and the golfer will do something. One of the hazard cards that will show up, that I noticed only shows up if you have a lot of money in the bank, is that you'll have some sort of hazard where either the golfer takes money or you hit a ball and you hit someone in the head and you're sued, and it takes a large amount of money. So I never saw it. I had this one hazard where, you get sued and you have to pay $1,250 in golf bucks. Well, I never saw that when I first started playing and I didn't have a lot of golf bucks. I only saw that hazard come up when I had a lot of money. And it suspects to me that in the design of the game, I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure a good designer thought this through. If they put that hazard in when you only had, 1,200 golf bucks or 1,300 golf bucks and they took 1,250 from you, you would probably get so angry that you would quit. And the first time they took a lot of golf bucks from me, I was very angry. I thought about saying, I'm not playing this game anymore. But I had more than enough that it wasn't going to deplete me. And the second time it happened, that's when I noticed, oh no, this is deliberate. They probably have some trigger that this hazard gets added into the deck if you're over a certain amount of bucks. Why is that important? They don't want you to amass so much currency that the currency no longer has value. Think of it in terms of inflation. The more you have, the less valuable it is if you have so much that you can buy whatever you want. They do a good job, and this goes back to flow, of maintaining that tension. As long as as you lose money, as your bank of golf bucks, again, this is not real money, but your golf bucks and what you can do with them within the narrative of the game, as you lose it, it becomes more compelling. You want to do things, you want to come back and play so that you can make some of that back. The use of gold gradients, and I can tell you there have been times, in fact, I've played this game twice. The first time I got introduced to the game, I actually deleted it from my phone because I found myself doing things like which is something I swore I would never do, was spend money on a stupid game. But that compulsion to be that close to be able to win a challenge or to get to the next level, and I was out of cards and I was out of golf clubs, it would make me spend $1 or it wouldn't make me, but it enough of a motivation. The motivation though was intrinsic. The motivation was, I'm this close and I just want to finish this game. And all I need is to buy one more club. So it's 99 cents. It's a dollar. I'll spend the dollar and I'll buy the club. That is when I know this is a well-designed game, because if it could get this is how you get people to spend money. Something that you would never think, most people and very few games convert, less than 1% of games, free games, convert. But if you get enough people to play them, those dollars add up. And I have to say, of the different I've played plenty of games that try to entice you to pay to buy things, and I've never been enticed. This is probably the first game where I've actually been enticed to actually spend my money, and it's because of how masterfully they put these mechanics together. So again, showing the rewards. So this is the power of narrative. None of this works without a compelling narrative to tie it all together. And they have used that narrative in turn to give themselves a map for how to use these mechanics in very strategic ways to accomplish their goal. So context, continuity, and I also want to point out the other place where narrative is extremely valuable and beneficial is in aiding a transition to complexity. So one of the things that you will notice is, there are all these different icons at the bottom, different things that you have to learn how to do. And as I mentioned before, you've got these golf clubs and you've got these, levelers and different things. They don't introduce this to you all at once. They gradually introduce the complexity, they gradually introduce the tournaments, they gradually introduce more things that you can do. So that again, that's part of flow, so that the complexity of playing the game and your ability to play and to take advantage of these different features that exist are slowly introduced as you become more familiar and more able to manage the complexity of the game. But the story, the narrative that it's embedded in can either help or obscure that. And in this example, the use of narrative allows them to keep you invested in the game and stick with it enough so that they can slowly make the game more complex, bring in more features, more storylines, more aspects of the game, and you stick with it because, in part, the narrative makes it fun to do. So let's take a moment and talk about, what does this mean for education, though? As I said last week, an advantage that game designers have that we as educators don't is that they can make this stuff up from scratch. They can sit in a room, a bunch of them, with I guess with beer pong or something, and think about what would be interesting. We're trying to lay these principles onto existing constraints and existing conditions. And then within that, I thought this was a good time to distinguish between individuals who are actually thinking about bringing game design principles into a class versus someone who may be trying to apply game design principles, say, to a program. So the first tip that I would give is to think about creating your narrative if it's a program around identity, whereas for the classroom, to use the content to create the narrative. So what do I mean? So for the program, well, let's think about it practically speaking. At the college-wide level, every college uses some form of identity or narrative, and it's usually personified or I'm not even gonna say that word because I know I'm gonna butcher it, but you know what I mean. Through the form of the mascot, right? So if you go to Notre Dame, you know that you're part of the Fighting Irish. If you go to one of my alma maters, I have several, but I'll use the alma mater who just won the national championship, Villanova. Then my identity when I'm rooting for them and was cheering for them winning the national championship is I'm a Wildcat, right? Or I think Villanova also uses the term Nova Nation. The point is you're creating a narrative around your identity as a campus. So you can build from that, right? Um, and so within a program, you can do the same thing. What opportunities do you have to build a narrative around, maybe it's your major, or maybe it's the dorm, or maybe it's whatever, even if it's academic support services, can you create a narrative around the activities you're doing or the challenges that you want to create, a story that allows you to then build progression and missions and challenges and all of these different mechanics that we can string together to make participation more engaging. In the classroom, I would say, if the content is history, can you create a narrative around the subject of that history that you're going to be studying over the course of the year? Think about the play Hamilton, which is, a phenomena that used art and merged art, different art forms to tell a story about history, about our history that otherwise, we're trying to force students to learn, and yet they're using the music, they're singing the rap songs, and now they're learning about a topic. So it's the narrative and the way the narrative that was presented around that content. And in fact, I know in Hamilton they actually have a curriculum that they make available to schools that leverages the popularity of the music to help make the content more memorable. That's a game design approach. Is there a way for you to do that? Now, I'll be the first to admit, how do you gamify? How do you create a narrative around calculus? Couldn't tell you. That was not my strongest. That was not my strongest course, not by a long shot. But the idea is still, how do you create some larger context that you can infuse some fun into? The next are rewards. So what the point that I hope I illustrated in talking about the golf bucks and the golf clubs was that rewards don't always have to be monetary. They don't have to be necessarily something that you would spend money on to still be meaningful and therefore be a very effective mechanic to incorporate. So you can have uh, campus wide rewards. I would pause now to say that if you're not a follower or haven't listened to the podcast that we do, Genius Cafe, I had as a recent guest Scott Ranke, who is the coordinator of the Ball State Achievements app. It's one of the first university-wide game applications for student success. They're not using our model, but we've presented together, and there's a lot of overlap. But he talks about the rewards, some of the rewards that they offer. He offers some example, and they are campus specific. They're specific to what is valuable to students on that campus, and they have some currency. He gives one example. I don't want to give too much away. I would strongly, please, very, very strongly encourage you to listen to that particular episode. It was really, really, really great. But he talks about one of the rewards in their game that they offer is the ability to go attend classes, fitness classes in their fitness area, and that the classes are not free. The students have to pay. So at the same time that if the students go to those classes, they can earn their currency are called bennies. They can earn those bennies, but then if they earn enough, they can then use them to take a class for free. This is not unlike what happens when you go to Starbucks or to your local car wash, and you get a little card that if you come, 9 times and get your car wash, you get the 10th car wash for free. It's the same thing. But within your campus, you can use the resources that are valuable within your campus, and you can use something called privilege unlocks. So in addition to, providing something of value that's specific to the campus, that can include the privilege of doing something. It could be, for instance, if you reach a certain level, you get to register a semester early. Well, if getting in early to be able to get your class is valuable on your campus, then that's a valuable reward that didn't cost you a dime to create. So it's thinking outside of the box. Now, conversely, in the classroom, you can have course specific rewards. And this again is up to the instructor. Some instructors hate the idea, some instructors are very playful around it. But you can do things like I saw recently 2 different faculty members on Twitter who challenged the students to get, you know, 1,000 or 100,000 retweets of something. And if they, as a group, were able to do that, then the reward would be they would, they would be given one of the questions to the midterm or the final. And again, I know that there may be some educators who would hear that and be appalled. I'm using it as an example. The point being, that is very much specific to that class. And if the purpose of the instructor was, 1, to encourage students to work together, or 2, to disseminate an important message, then you are actually having a trade-off, and you're getting the students to benefit or to learn something valuable that's outside of the course content. What I would say related to that is progress itself can be a privilege. So depending on how you structure the information or structure your course assignments, the ability to access something that you hold out as being a privilege, like, the master's level. This is sort of equated to the boss fights, that, okay, we have an intermediate level of assignment, but if you do really well on this, you'll get extra recognition for being able to then have access to this more challenging assignment, depending on your class, depending on the students, how competitive they are, how into it they are. This privilege of being able to be recognized for that can also be valuable. So the point is, there are lots of creative ways that you can use the narrative and you can use the designs that we've talked about to create the momentum and excitement and emotion that moves students forward, that makes them want to do more rather than less. That's what game design is. Um, and then finally, goal gradients. We talked about that before. Find a way to make the feedback more more immediate. This is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have in higher education. If you think about the traditional semester, and I've been doing this a long time. I've been a part of these conversations, especially in college. It depends on the faculty member. There are some students who won't get their first feedback by way of a quiz or feedback on a written assignment until week 4 or week 5. And so they have no way of knowing how they're doing. And depends on the instructor, it depends on the course that you're in. If it's an online course, there's certain mechanisms that may be built in to get feedback in sooner. But if you're in a traditional classroom, depending on the instructor, that does happen. And it's very easy as a faculty member not to think about what that feels like to go that many weeks and not know whether you're making progress. And then add to it, if after all of those weeks, if after week 4 or week 5 of a 12 or 15-week semester, your first feedback is that you did horribly, how demotivating is that? How demoralizing is that? So are there ways that we can give many forms of feedback? And that's what I mean by grade gradients. Are there piecemeal ways? Now, I've done something called uh, assignment menus that I think fall within this, and I will be doing a separate webinar and conversations on gamifying within the classroom. But what I will say is it does build on these comments that I have here about grade gradients and progress is privilege and course specific rewards. But for a program, goal gradients are again specific to whatever the goal is. So I'm going to use again the example of academic support. If what your goal is to get more students to use tutoring, to participate in tutoring, and then because and we do know that if they go to tutoring, the odds are that they're going to do better in their courses. How can you present their progress in a way, and whether it's, hey, you've gotten 5 points for just showing up the first day, now extended to 10. Look, you're halfway towards your first milestone, right? Think about ways to break up the accomplishments and the achievements you're trying to get students to achieve so that it doesn't take a month or 6 weeks for them to see that they've made progress. And there's some other resources that I'll do a separate webinar on. The motivational incentives that actually comes out of the mental health, substance abuse community, but has a lot of evidence behind its effectiveness when used as a targeted task achievement strategy. That all falls within that category. So the point is, if you build a narrative around all of it, if you start with wrapping it in a compelling story or a fun story, just something that was interesting, you actually uh, you're actually halfway there. So I just want to revisit or present again, and this was from last week's webinar, the showing the emotions and how they map to the game design model. You clearly want to think about the emotions that you're trying to engender at each step of the way, but all of this marries together. So what kind of story can you write, can you design, that starts with curiosity or surprise or joy, and then builds in some interest and anticipation, and then a sense of enthusiasm and excitement? How can you wrap that in the form of a story? So, my tips for trying to do this and takeaways are this: start simple, and this is a variation on the tip I gave in the previous webinar where I said start small. What you saw was an example with the Fairway Solitaire of a game that one has a lot of designers working on it, has been around for a while. In fact, when I was looking for images, I came across some images that were clearly from earlier versions of that game that were much simpler, that didn't have all of the different bells and whistles that I showed you in today's webinar. And that's because I'm sure they added them over time as they got more experience with players playing the game. The same is true here. Start simple. It's what we've been saying in every webinar. Start with one arc, one progression, one series of loops. And as you start, hopefully, if you've been following along with this webinar series, you've been playing around with a series of tasks and activities that you would put together. Now we're just saying, what kind of story could you wrap that in? Use layers. Remember, that's the whole idea of linking arcs to arcs, loops within arcs, and then arcs connected to arcs. It's everything is not done at once. What game designers do really well that we still can learn a lot from is that they isolate specific tasks. And if you find that you have students who are struggling with a task, whatever it is academically, there's probably too much packed into it. So the challenge we have as educators is to break that up. And just remember, it may not seem like it's too many things because you're now an expert in it. It's very hard to remember what it was like to be a novice, but just use that as a clue. If they're struggling with a loop, if we think of tasks now, if nothing else, if our journey together through game design is to use this terminology to think of tasks that we want our students to complete to get better as loops. If they're struggling with a loop, if they keep failing out, if they can't finish that loop, you've probably got too much packed into it. How could you break that task or that set of experiences into 4 or 5 loops instead of 1? And then use layers to make that progress. Be visual. You don't have to have a graphic designer. You don't have to have a mobile app. If you're going to do something like a group competition or a group challenge or a mission, as long as you have a physical space, you can use, poster board and write it up and create a little felt marker thermometer to show that people are making progress. What they want is visual reminders that they're making progress. And if you've got a space where you can show that on your campus, great. If you can't, create a PowerPoint slide and then send it out to the students in email. Here's your update on how you're doing so far. What people want is to know that they're making progress. If you can make it a fun competition, if you can make it a group activity, which is what we've talked about and we'll be talking about next, all the better. And then finally, I'm going to make a novel recommendation. I know taking time to read is always a challenge, although we are now, this webinar is being broadcast for the first time in May, which means we're at the end of a semester. So if you've got time and you'll be thinking about this in preparation for next semester, I recommend reading a book called Writing the Pilot by William Rabkin. It's a non-traditional recommendation. This book is actually guidance for someone who wants to write a TV pilot. The reason why I recommend it, though, as a part of our conversation around narrative, is that one of the points, actually the core point that he makes very early in this book, is that writing a pilot to a TV series is different from writing a novel, is different from writing a movie, because it's not self-contained. That if you're trying to sell a TV pilot to a studio, what they're looking for is something that can span several seasons, and that many novice writers who think they have an idea for a pilot only thinking about writing a standalone pilot, which he says is useless. And it was that notion that you've actually got to be thinking about, how is this story going to be unfold over time? How are the characters going to unfold over time? That is a perfect parallel to what you need to do if you're trying to design a game design approach to anything, right? It's a great corollary or metaphor to our challenge. You cannot accomplish your goal through game design with one loop. And you can't even accomplish it with one arc in all likelihood, right? And so the same admonition that he gives, don't think in terms of what this one story and this pilot is going to be. Think about how it's going to play out over time. It's the same challenge that you have if you want to apply a game design approach to whatever your educational challenge and goal is. I'm just here to say that it absolutely can be done. And so this might be a fun way of getting you to think about it in a different way. So as always, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this as you stumbled upon it at some later date, you can at any point go to our broadcast page. We'll be adding the links to it, to the YouTube channel so that you can go to it later, but you want to get to our broadcast page so that you can post any comments or questions because those will live on perpetually and will allow me or anyone on my team to be able to respond as you start trying to play around with this and may run into some challenges or want to bounce around some ideas. Our comment section below the video on the broadcast page is the place to do that. So we're coming to nearly the end of our series. We have 3 more sessions to come, and the next one will be 4 types of fun. This is a model by Nicole Lazzaro that we're gonna do a deep dive into. You know, the whole point of applying game design to education is to introduce fun to it. And so this is the session where going to actually talk more about what that means, what options are available to us when it comes to applying fun to our educational goals, and really take a closer look at why we should be doing more of that. So that's what we'll do on our next webinar. I think that brings us almost up to our hour. As always, I thank you so much for listening and watching this, and I encourage you to jump in and give game design a try. And I will see you in the next webinar.